Now the question I'm dealing with is, where did we come from as human beings, and how long have we been here? Now today, the most common answers to these questions come from the modern followers of Charles Darwin. And some of my friends tell me, Michael, maybe you're a reincarnation of Charles Darwin, and you've had to take birth again to correct your mistake. Well, the modern followers of Charles Darwin, many of them anyways, tell us that as human beings, we are simply complex organizations of molecules. That's what we really are. We're simply material beings. And as far as consciousness and love and all of that goes, that is just chemicals interacting in the brain. There's nothing more to it than that. There's no vital force or soul or conscious self. That's all just an illusion. We're really just machines made of matter. And as far as our human form is concerned, we're simply an evolved ape or monkey. That's what we are. And as we look towards the future, I don't accept this theory. First of all, because I believe there's some scientific evidence that contradicts it. But also, this theory, I believe, has some social impact. The goals that we set for ourselves individually and collectively depend on our concept of the self, our sense of identity. And through the monopoly they now have in the education systems in most parts of the world, the scientists who support the Darwinian theory of evolution are giving us a very materialistic concept of the self. They're saying, well, as human beings, we are just machines made of matter. And if we accept that, and most people do these days, they tend to become very materialistic in the goals that they set for themselves. They tend to think that to produce and consume more and more material things is the main purpose of human life. And I believe it's this fundamental attitude, this fundamental mistaken sense of identity that is responsible for the world's environmental crisis. And Peter laid out some of the dimensions of that, and I believe also the underlying cause. And I believe the underlying cause is a materialistic, overly materialistic sense of identity. And we're told that not only are we machines made of matter, we are machines made of matter in competition with each other for survival. As Richard Dawkins charmingly put it, we are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. So I believe it's this attitude that is responsible for the intense levels of conflict that we see in the world today. We see conflict on the level of individuals, conflict on the level of class, society, nation, religion, a lot of unnecessary conflict that is not really very helpful in any way for our human civilization. So the solution to the environmental crisis, the solution to the intense levels of conflict, I believe has to lie with going back to the very root, back to our sense of identity, who we are, where we came from, where we should be going. And I think we need a new science that recognizes that there's more to a human being than chemicals, more to a human being than ordinary matter. We need a science that recognizes the vital forces, the vital energies that are there, that are part of the human essence, and that recognize the existence of a conscious self that can exist apart from matter. So what I've tried to do in my book, Human Devolution, is give some rational scientific justification for thinking that these things are true. And I'm not claiming any monopoly on truth, either for myself or for the Vedic perspective. I think truth can be found in many places, and I encourage people to look wherever their path leads them. Mine has led me in a certain direction, but others may follow different paths. Now, the first thing I want to show is that we really do need an alternative explanation for human origins in strictly scientific terms. Let's first look at what the current theories tell us. They tell us that life began on Earth from chemicals about 2 billion years ago. Then simple life forms arose in the oceans. Then they went to the land. Then about 40 or 50 million years ago, you get the first apes and monkeys. And then about 6 million years ago, you get the first ape men. And then finally, about 100,000 or 200,000 years ago, you get humans like us for the first time on Earth. But ancient wisdom traditions tell a different story. For example, the ancient Sanskrit writings of India tell us that humans have existed since the very beginning of the history of life on Earth. We're not a recent appearance here. But many scientists will say, okay, well, that's what your mythology says, but all the physical evidence supports our point of view. It supports this evolutionary picture of human origins that we see here. But when I did 8 years of research into the entire history of archaeology, I found that there is physical evidence showing that humans like us have existed for millions and millions of years on Earth, going all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life here. And this evidence takes the form of human bones, human footprints, and human artifacts, many, many millions of years old. So I documented this evidence in this book, Forbidden Archaeology, which is about 900 pages long. Some people call it forbidding archaeology because it just seems like too much to pick up. So we brought out this book in a shorter edition called The Hidden History of the Human Race, which has now been translated into 20 languages. This is the Russian edition, the French edition. This is the Bulgarian edition. Now, the evidence that I document in these books is not very well known because of a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. We can call the blue box up there the knowledge filter, and it represents the fixed ideas that most scientists today now have about this question of human origins. So reports of evidence that conform to these fixed ideas will pass through this intellectual filter very easily, which means that students will read about this evidence in their textbooks. People will see scientists talking about it on TV shows. If they go to the local museum, they'll see these discoveries. But if we have evidence that radically contradicts these fixed ideas, they tend to be ignored, forgotten, even actively suppressed. So I'm going to give a few examples of the kind of evidence that I'm talking about. This is Virginia Steen McIntyre. She's an American geologist who I know personally. When she was a young woman, just after she got her PhD, she was a rising star in her profession. But then she was called to Mexico to date an archaeological site called Huayatlaco. This is the excavation at Huayatlaco. The American and Mexican archaeologists there found human artifacts in layers of solid rock. And of course, they wanted to know how old they were. So they called a team of geologists to date the site. Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues used 4 different methods to date the site, and they got an age of about 250,000 years. But the archaeologists said, we can't accept that. That's impossible. According to their theories, human beings capable of making the artifacts didn't exist anywhere in the world at that time. They hadn't evolved yet. So they refused to publish the age for the site given by their own hand-picked team of geologists. And Virginia Steen McIntyre decided, well, I'll independently publish the age for the site. If these archaeologists won't publish it, I will. So she did that. And when she did, she experienced an extreme negative backlash from her colleagues in the scientific world. She was labeled a troublemaker, a publicity seeker, a maverick. She wrote to the editor of the journal that published her report, "Not being an anthropologist, I didn't realize how deeply woven into our thought the current theory of human evolution has become. Our work at Huayatlaco has been rejected by most archaeologists because it contradicts that theory, period." So this is how this knowledge filtering process works. Now here's a case from England. This is the Red Crag Formation at a place called Walton-on-Naze. The Red Crag Formation is this layer here. It's got this reddish color. And this is where Walton-on-Naze is in East Anglia, near Ipswich. And there's some fossil shells that are found in this formation, the Red Crag Formation. Now, in 1881, the geologist Henry Stopes made a report about a very interesting shell, that was found at in the Red Crag at Walton-on-Naze, and here it is. It's interesting because it has a very simple but nevertheless recognizable human face carved upon it, the first happy face. And he reported on it at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Now it's interesting because the Red Crag Formation is between 2 and 3 million years old. And according to most modern scientists, the very first symbolic marks made on shell or bone by humans are less than 100,000 years old. One of the oldest examples they have is some simple marks made on a piece of bone from the Blombos cave in South Africa, and they believe it's 77,000 years old. So to have this sort of thing at 2 or 3 million years old is really quite extraordinary. It was a very controversial find at the time. Many scientists heavily criticized Henry Stopes, but his daughter, Mary Stopes, who was also a geologist, defended her father's discovery in some scientific publications. And in the same part of England, I want to point out one thing, is that this carved shell with a human face on it has gone missing. No one can locate it today. That often happens with these discoveries related to extreme human antiquity. They tend to disappear. So that's the case with this, although we do have the photographs and original scientific reports. Now, another interesting discovery was made in the same region. It was a fossil human jaw from the same region. And this anatomically modern human jaw was found 16 feet deep in the Red Crag Formation at Foxhall in England in 1855. And Foxhall Hall is shown on this map. It's on the eastern outskirts of Ipswich, which is near to the place where the carved face was found on the the carved human face was found on the shell. So this human jawbone was also found in the Red Crag Formation, which is 2 or 3 million years old. So that's further evidence for a human presence in England going back 2 or 3 million years. Oops, wrong way. So later in the 20th century, another English researcher, J. Reed Moore of the Prehistoric Society of East Anglia, went to Foxhall and made some additional excavations there, and he found more evidence of a human presence in the form of stone tools and weapons and evidence for the deliberate use of fire. And the American anthropologist Henry Fairfield Osborn wrote, the discoveries of J. Reed Moore on the evidence of the existence of Pliocene man in East Anglia open a new epoch in archaeology. They bring indubitable evidence of the existence of man in southeast Britain, man of sufficient intelligence to fashion flints and to build fire before the close of the Pliocene. So the Pliocene is the geological period that extends from 2 million to 5 million years ago. So there's extensive evidence that humans were existing in England between 2 and 3 million years ago. So some people might say, well, that's from the early 20th century or the 19th century. What did they know back then? Where's such evidence being discovered in more modern times? And such evidence has been found. This is Mary Leakey, who in 1979 announced the discovery of many footprints at a place called Laetoli in the country of Tanzania in East Africa. And she said in her original report in National Geographic magazine, the footprints are indistinguishable from modern human footprints. And other scientists also agreed. Paleontologist Tim White said, make no mistake about it, they are like modern human footprints. Now that was pretty unusual because they were found in layers of solidified volcanic ash that geologists say are about 3 or 4 million years old. So at least 3 million years old. The most modern estimate says about 3,600,000 years. Now, neither Mary Leakey nor Tim White believe that human beings like us were present to make those footprints 3 million years ago in Africa. So how did they explain the footprints? Well, they proposed there must have been some kind of ape man who had feet exactly like modern human feet, and that's how the footprints were made. That's an interesting idea, but there's no physical evidence to support it. We have the skeletons of the ape men who existed at that time. They're called Australopithecus, and their foot structure is not like that of a modern human being. The foot skeletons of Australopithecus show that their foot was very ape-like. For example, their feet had very long toes, sort of like human fingers. Actually, the only creature known to science today that has a foot exactly like that of a modern human being is, in fact, a human being like us. So, what did Mary Leakey actually find? I believe she found evidence that humans like us were present 3 or 4 million years ago in Africa. Now let's jump a little further back in time. This is the Portuguese geologist Carlos Ribeiro. He discovered hundreds of human artifacts in his country of Portugal, And as a geologist, he said they cannot have come from any higher, more recent level. The layers of rock in which he found these objects were about 20 million years old. So he displayed the artifacts in the Museum of Geology in Lisbon with labels indicating an age of 20 million years. But if you go to the museum today, you won't see the artifacts displayed in those cases anymore. Today, they're kept locked in these cabinets down here. But I got permission from the director of the museum to open up those cabinets, and I was able to study and photograph some of these 20 million year old human artifacts from Portugal. By studying Ribeiro's original documents, I was able to go out into the countryside of Portugal and relocate some of the places where he made his discoveries. For example, this is the quarry at Morganheira, and here's one of the artifacts that he found there. It's a flint artifact, pointed. Now, it's interesting what happened. When Ribeiro was alive, he displayed the artifacts in the museum with labels indicating an age of 20 million years. After he died, his colleagues did something interesting. They left the artifacts on display in the museum, but they wrote new labels for all of them, giving them far younger ages. This is the new label that they wrote for the artifact I just showed you. The second line here gives the age. It says in Portuguese, Paleolítico Superior. That means Upper Paleolithic. And according to modern archaeologists, that period in Europe goes back about 20,000 years. So Ribeiro's colleagues thought 20 million years, that's impossible. 20,000 years, that sounds about right. So they wrote new labels for all of the artifacts. And then the next generation of officials in the museum just put the entire collection away, new labels and all. And I'm the first researcher in over 50 years to see them. One case that's always fascinated me is the California gold mine discoveries. In the 19th century, gold was discovered in California, and miners went there to get the gold. To get the gold, they dug tunnels into the sides of mountains like Table Mountain here in California, in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And deep inside the tunnels, the miners found human bones and human artifacts. For example, they found many of these stone mortars and pestles. And what makes these discoveries so interesting to me is that they were found in layers of solid rock that belong to the early part of the geological period called the Eocene, which means they would be about 50 million years old. These discoveries were reported to the scientific world by Dr. J.D. Whitney. He was the chief government geologist of California. His report was published by Harvard University, but we don't hear very much about these discoveries today because of the process of knowledge filtration. Here is the scientist most responsible for the knowledge filtering in this particular case. This is William Holmes, an anthropologist who worked at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And he wrote, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, he would not have published those reports. In other words, if the facts did not support the theory, then the facts had to be set aside. And that's what happened. However, a few years ago, I was a consultant for a television program called The Mysterious Origins of Man, which was shown on NBC, the largest American television network. And the producer had read my book, Forbidden Archaeology, so he got in touch with me. He wanted to include some of the cases from the book in this documentary. So I told him he should go to the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley, because I knew that some of the 50-million-year-old human artifacts from the California gold mines are still in the collection of that museum. So he went there, but the museum officials refused to allow him to see the artifacts, what to speak of film them. Nevertheless, we were able to find some photographs that were taken of the artifacts by Dr. Whitney in the 19th century. So we did have some imagery to use in the television program. It was interesting when scientists in America found out that NBC was going to show this program, they tried to stop NBC from showing it. They weren't successful. Actually, it was a very popular program, and recently a DVD has been released that has the entire program, plus many of the outtakes, interviews with me and others that weren't included in the broadcast show. But when scientists found out that NBC was going to show this, they tried to stop NBC. They weren't successful. So then they went to the government. They went to the Federal Communications Commission, which is the agency of the government in the United States that regulates the TV broadcasting industry. And they asked the government to investigate NBC, to censure NBC, to force NBC to broadcast apologies, public apologies for having shown this program. And they also wanted the government to fine NBC millions of dollars so that they would never do anything like this again. Now, I'm happy to say the government did do this, but it was interesting to me that these sorts of attempts were made to prevent this information from reaching the people. Now, more recently, I went back to the museum myself. I was preparing a report about these discoveries for a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress, the world's largest international organization of archaeologists. And perhaps because of my connection with the World Archaeological Congress, the museum officials decided they would let me see the artifacts. And they're not kept in the museum itself. They're kept in a storage building several miles from the museum. I had to be accompanied every step of the way by a museum official, and entering this building was quite an experience, with all these card readers and security levels to go through. But the artifacts are still there, and these are some of them. These are some of the 50-million-year-old artifacts from the California gold mines. And many people have seen the movie Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, where in the final scenes they go into the basements of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington and see all kinds of discoveries that are being kept from the public. And many people think, well, that's just Hollywood. But these things actually do happen. There are human artifacts that are extremely old that aren't displayed to the public, but which are in the collections of these museums. After studying some of Dr. Whitney's original reports, I went into the mountains of California, and this is Table Mountain as it looks today, and we were able to relocate some of the old 19th century gold mining tunnels where these objects were discovered, and it should be possible to do more research there. Now, how far back in time can we go with evidence like this? In the year 1862, a scientific journal called The Geologist published an interesting report. An anatomically modern human skeleton was found 30 meters below the surface of the ground in the state of Illinois in America. And according to modern geologists, the level at which the skeleton was found is about 300 million years old. And directly above the skeleton was a thick layer of slate rock, which was unbroken, which means the skeleton cannot have come down from any higher, more recent level. It had to be as old as the layer on which it was found. In this case, 300 million years which is older than the dinosaurs. This interesting report from Scientific American tells of a beautiful metallic vase that was found 5 meters deep in solid rock near Boston. According to modern geological reports, the age of the formation in which the object was found is about 600 million years. The oldest objects I found in my research come from South Africa. Miners in the western Transvaal region have found many of these round objects. They're made of hematite, which is a naturally occurring type of iron. The most interesting feature is the parallel grooves that go around the center of each object. These were shown on the NBC television program, but before NBC agreed to allow them to be shown, they said, you have to give them to an independent company of metallurgists to examine. So we did that, and the metallurgists gave a report saying they could not explain how those grooves could have formed naturally in the layers of the earth, which means they had to have been made by someone with human-like intelligence. Now these objects, these hematite spheres, are found solidly embedded in mineral deposits over 2 billion years old. So I could go on and on. I could keep you here until Christmas, going through one case after another, but I'm not going to do that because there are other things I want to talk about. But I'll ask you to remember one thing. There are some scientists who say all the physical evidence supports this evolutionary picture of human origins, with humans coming into existence about 100,000 years ago. It's not true that all of the physical evidence supports that idea. When we actually look at all the physical evidence, we find a continuous chain of discoveries of human bones, human footprints, human artifacts, many, many millions of years old, going all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life on Earth, which means we need some new explanations for human origins. And in this book, I've offered a Vedic alternative theory of human origins, which has a lot in common with ideas of human origins that we find in many ancient wisdom traditions. Now, before we even ask the question, where did human beings come from, we should first of all ask the question, what is a human being? We should know what it is we're trying to explain. Now, today, many scientists will tell us that a human being or any other living thing is just a complex organization of the ordinary chemical elements. We're just machines made of matter. But I believe if we carefully look at all of the evidence, we'll see that it's more reasonable to say that a human being is made of 3 things. Ordinary matter, yes, but beyond that, there is a subtle mind element with some very unusual powers. And beyond that, there is a conscious self that can exist apart from matter. So, when I speak of mind and matter, I don't mean temporary byproducts of bioelectrical activity in the brain. I mean real things with their own independent existence. Now, at this point, some scientists will say, now hold on just a minute. That's not how we do science. We don't start introducing all kinds of strange new substances into our picture of scientific reality like mind and consciousness. This is science. In science, we deal with what we know, and what we know is matter, the chemical elements. So therefore, if we're going to be scientific, we should try to explain everything about human origins in terms of matter organizing itself. Anything else is mythology or something, but it's not science. However, that's not really true. Modern science does operate in a way that involves introducing new substances into our picture of reality. Let's look at cosmology, for example. Until the 1970s, when astronomers looked at the sky, they tried to explain everything they could observe in terms of ordinary matter operating according to known gravitational laws. They found they were not able to do that. For example, they found they could not explain the spiral structure of galaxies in that way. To explain what they actually observed, astronomers introduced a strange new substance they call dark matter, which you cannot observe, but it has a gravitational effect. And they found even that was not enough. So more recently, they've introduced an even stranger new thing they call dark energy, which has a force that operates the opposite of gravity. Gravity attracts, this dark energy pushes things outward. So today, astrophysicists believe the cosmos is composed of only 5% ordinary matter, the chemical elements. They believe that 30% is composed of this strange new substance called dark matter, and that 65% is composed of the even stranger new substance they call dark energy. So I think the same sort of thing is necessary in biology. I don't think we can explain everything we can observe about human beings in terms of the chemical elements, ordinary matter. I think we need to introduce new substances into our picture of biological reality. And I'm not the only one who's saying that. This is Rodney Brooks, who works at the Artificial Life Lab at MIT. A few years ago, he published an interesting article in Nature. He commented that the programs of artificial life and artificial intelligence are failing to deliver the results that most scientists expected would be possible. And that's interesting because if life really is just a combination of matter, we should be able to duplicate important features of life in computers and machines like robots. And we are to a certain limited extent, but we are not able to produce anything that is remotely like what human beings are really capable of. So he was wondering, why are we failing? Could it be we don't have powerful enough computers? Maybe our algorithms aren't complex enough? He decided, no, we've got excellent computers, we've got excellent computer programmers and technicians who can build robots. What's the problem? The real problem, he said, is this. There might be some extra sort of stuff in living systems outside our current scientific understanding. And what might that extra stuff be? Among the possibilities he was considering were some ineffable entities such as a soul or elan vital, some vital force. And I agree with him. I think we do need to add some new substances into our picture of biological reality. I think we need to add a mind substance and the substance of consciousness. And I think there's some scientific justification for this. The ordinary matter we don't have to talk about. Everybody accepts that. But what about scientific evidence for the existence of a subtle mind element associated with the human organism with very unusual powers that cannot be explained by our current laws of physics? There is some evidence for this, but it's been subjected to the knowledge filtering process so that you won't find it mentioned in the official education system or scientific institutions. And I'll give some examples of evidence for a mind element. Mind is something like air. We can't see air, but when air moves over an element that we can see, like water, we can observe its effects. We can see waves forming. So mind is something like that. We cannot see the mind, but many scientists have observed the very unusual effects of mind on ordinary matter. Now, one of these scientists was a famous English scientist, Alfred Russel Wallace. He was, along with Darwin, the co-founder of the theory of evolution by natural selection, but we rarely hear his name these days. And that's because he became interested in research into the paranormal. And when he became interested in research in the paranormal, Darwin wrote to him saying, I don't know what you're up to. I think you're going to murder our joint child, the theory of evolution, by getting into all this paranormal stuff. But Wallace continued with his research, and he was joined in his research by another prominent English scientist, Sir William Crookes, who was later a president of the Royal Society and a very prominent physicist. Together, they studied mediums. Now, mediums are people with paranormal powers. They did a lot of research with the medium Daniel Dunglass Hume, who was originally from Scotland, I believe. And Hume had some interesting abilities. You know, for example, he could take an accordion, hold it on the top end, opposite the keys, and the accordion would play very elaborate tunes. So Wallace and Crookes decided to study this. They wanted to make sure that he wasn't, surreptitiously like some magician, getting his other hand down there on the keys to play it, or somehow or other tricking them. So to prevent that, they built a cage. This is their experimental apparatus. And he had to hold the accordion at the top here, opposite the keys, and this cage would prevent him from getting his other hand down there or his foot or whatever to manipulate the keys and cause it to play some very elaborate tune. Another possibility they considered was, well, maybe he had some kind of trick accordion with some mechanism inside it. So they bought a completely new accordion from a music store and used that in their experiments. And the experimental setup was like this. Hume had to sit with one hand on top of the table, his other hand on the accordion. And even under those carefully controlled conditions, he was still able to cause the accordion to play very elaborate tunes. But it doesn't stop there. Both Wallace, the co-founder of the theory of evolution, and Crookes, a president of the Royal Society, they both testified that on occasion they would see him take his hand completely out of the cage, and the accordion would be floating in the cage all by itself, playing very elaborate tunes. Now, you're not going to read about that in your physics textbooks, but these things were actually reported by these prominent English scientists. Another thing that both Wallace and Crookes observed were levitations by Hume. Now, we know that there are magicians who can perform the illusion of a levitation, but it requires some kind of apparatus. So what they would do is they would go to Hume's apartment, his lodgings in London, unannounced, and just say, "Come with us right now." And they would take him to some place he'd never been before, the home of some gentleman, a scientist or scholar, with nobody to assist him, no apparatus. They would simply take him to the middle of the parlor or whatever, and then they would observe him levitating under these circumstances. And it happened once in the home of Crookes. And he said he felt everywhere, around him, below him, beside him, over him. No wires, no apparatus. He's just floating in the air. On another occasion, the scientists had him on the third floor of a building in a room, and they observed him assume a horizontal floating position, float out a window on the third floor, and then float and come in another window horizontally, and then assume a vertical position. So I take this as evidence for a subtle mind element. Of course, those into shamanic realities will understand that mind over matter is a very real thing, and those that are able to control the mind can actually do these things. Now, another example. Every physics student learns about the work of Pierre and Marie Curie. They were husband and wife. They both got Nobel Prizes in physics for their work in discovering radium and other things. And you read about this in every introductory physics textbook. What you don't read about is that they were heavily involved in research into the paranormal. They were part of a group of 20 prominent European scientists who were doing such research in Paris early in the 20th century. The group included 5 Nobel Prize winners. the group did 2 years of experiments with the Italian medium Eusapia Palladino. And this woman had some very unusual powers, mind over matter, psychokinetic types of abilities. So on one occasion, they had the medium in the Psychology Institute in Paris, not in somebody's dark parlor, which is the normal sort of preconception. They had her in broad daylight in a scientific institution in Paris. They put her in a chair. Marie Curie, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, held her hands. Other scientists held her feet, completely controlling her motions. And under these conditions, Pierre Curie, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, said that he observed a large table in the lab floating about 1 meter off the ground in the presence of this woman. And after 2 years of such results, the entire group of scientists signed documents saying these things are absolutely true, and we have to take them into account if we're going to have a complete picture of reality. But you're not going to read about this in your physics books today. In more recent times, Robert John, head of the engineering department at Princeton University, did some very interesting experiments with random number generators. Random number generators are computer-like machines that will generate as an output a genuinely random series of zeros and ones. If you let the machines run by themselves, they'll generate 50% zeros, 50% ones. But John and his colleagues asked students from the university to sit in front of these machines and simply will mentally that the machines produce more ones than zeros or more zeros than ones. And these experiments went on for over 10 years. They're very well documented. And the students were actually able to do it. They were actually able to cause the output of the random number generators to vary just according to their mental intention. So again, this is more evidence, I believe, for the existence of a subtle mind element associated with the human organism that can act on ordinary matter in ways we can't explain by our current laws of physics. There have also been some very interesting experiments carried out at universities in Europe on extrasensory perception. In these experiments, one person called a receiver is put into a very relaxed state. Meanwhile, at another location, another person called a sender is shown an image randomly selected by a computer. The sender tries to mentally send the image to the receiver. And then, at the end of each trial, the receiver is shown 4 images, one of which is the actual target image. And the receiver has to select from the 4, which was the image that was being sent. Now, if you run this experiment for tens of thousands of times, and you assume there's no paranormal effect, then you would expect that the receivers will pick the correct image 1 time out of 4, 25% of the time. However, the researchers find that the receivers are able to pick the image at a rate greatly exceeding 25% of the time, indicating they are able to pick up the mental image that is being sent to them by the sender. So there's a lot more that could be said, but I think this is sufficient to show that if we're going to talk about human origins, we can't just consider the chemical elements. We have to also consider this subtle mind element with its very unusual powers. Now, what about scientific evidence for a conscious self that can exist completely apart from the body? There is such evidence. It comes from medical studies of out-of-body experiences. Now, there are times when a person should be completely unconscious, like when you're listening to a long, boring lecture like this right after lunch. Is everybody still conscious? Okay, we'll go on. Maybe I'll succeed in putting you to sleep later. For example, during a heart attack, the heart stops beating, blood stops flowing to the brain, medical instruments show that the brain waves cease. At a time like that, a person should be completely unconscious. But many people in that condition report separating from their bodies, looking down and observing what the doctors and nurses trying to revive them are doing. The American cardiologist Michael Sabin heard some of these reports from his patients, and he wondered, are they telling the truth or are they just making up some stories? So he did a study. He selected 25 heart attack patients who had reported these kinds of experiences, and he carefully interviewed each one of them. He wanted to know, what did you actually see the doctors and nurses doing? Tell me in every detail what you observed. Then he went to the doctors and nurses who had treated these patients, and he asked to see their detailed medical records. And the patients do not see these detailed medical records. And in each case, every case is not the same. Different treatments are given in each case. But he found that the reports given by the patients matched the records kept by the physicians who had treated them, indicating that they were not just making up some stories. They were actually reporting real experiences. So these kinds of studies have been repeated at many medical institutions around the world. Now, in these cases, it appears that the conscious self separates from the brain, separates from the body, and then goes back into the same body. But that leads to another idea, namely the possibility that a conscious self may transfer from one body into another body. And of course, this is the basis of the idea of reincarnation or transmigration of the conscious self. And there is some scientific evidence for this. It comes from psychiatric studies of past life memories. Dr. Ian Stevenson and his colleagues studied thousands of cases of past life memories reported by young children in various countries around the world. And in over 800 of these cases, they were able to verify the existence of the person the child claimed to have been in the past life. So, still there are going to be skeptics who are going to say, do you really mean for me to take all this seriously as science? And I thought it was interesting that Carl Sagan, who was pretty skeptical about a lot of these things, said in his last book, The Demon-Haunted World, there are 3 claims in the ESP field which deserve serious study. 1, that by thought alone, humans can affect random number generators in computers. 2, that people under mild sense deprivation can perceive thoughts or images projected at them. And 3, that young children sometimes report the details of previous life. Now, I don't agree with Carl Sagan that those are the only things that deserve serious consideration and study, but even those 3 things alone are enough to make the point I'm trying to make, that there is more to a human being than chemicals. A human being is composed of 3 things: matter, mind, and consciousness. This leads to another idea, because we have to explain where all these things come from and how they come together in the human form. And this is the idea that we live in a multi-level cosmos. There's one level of the cosmos dominated by ordinary matter. It's inhabited by beings adapted to the conditions there. That's where we find ourselves now. Beyond that, there is a level of the cosmos dominated by the subtle mental energies. It's inhabited by beings adapted to the conditions there. And people have different names for them. They call them angels, astral beings, demigods, goddesses, many different names for them, jinn. And beyond that, there is the level of pure consciousness, which is inhabited by beings adapted to the conditions there. Now again, this may seem quite beyond the worldview of modern science, but it's part of the traditional worldviews of the world's great cultures. Christianity had a worldview like that during the medieval times, where you have a terrestrial level a level inhabited by angels and other subtle beings, and then finally some ultimately spiritual level, which I call the level of pure consciousness. And the Egyptian cosmology has that, Chinese cosmology, practically all the cosmologies of the world's ancient wisdom traditions had the idea of a multi-level cosmos. But it does seem quite beyond the range of modern science. So people may wonder, okay, ancient wisdom traditions talk about these things, but what sort of evidence is there in modern times that we exist in a multi-level inhabited cosmos? I think there are 6 categories of evidence that deserve consideration. One is communications from spirits of departed humans that are received by humans on this level of the cosmos. The other is possession of the bodies of living humans by spirits of departed humans. Third category is apparitions of spirits of departed humans, that become visible to humans in our level of existence. Fourth, possession of bodies of living humans by spirits of superhuman beings of either a divine or demoniac nature. Fifth, apparitions of superhuman beings. And sixth, the modern UFO alien abduction types of events. I'm going to give one example from each category of evidence. This is Sir Oliver Lodge, a prominent British physicist, lived in the late 19th century, early 20th century. During World War I, he lost a son, Raymond Lodge. He was killed in Europe during the Great War. And afterwards, Lodge tried to establish communication with the spirit of his departed son. And with this in mind, he approached a medium named Gladys Leonard. But he approached her in disguise so that she wouldn't know who he was, couldn't do any research about him. And through this medium, he was able to establish communication with the spirit of his departed son. And in these communications, things were revealed that would have only been known to his son Raymond. Now, afterwards, Lodge wrote a book about this case. And being a professional scientist, a very prominent scientist, he was very much aware of the kinds of objections that his scientific colleagues would give to the possibility of receiving communications from the spirit of a departed human being. So in this book, he gives very elaborate reasons for accepting the reality of the communications and deals with all these objections that would be given by his scientific colleagues. So I think it's a very interesting study by a professional scientist who believed in the possibility of establishing communication with spirits of departed humans. Now a case of spirit possession. This is the psychologist William James, considered to be the father of modern psychology. In his textbook, Principles of Psychology, he discusses what he regarded as a genuine case of spirit possession. Now, the case is called the Watseka Wonder. Watseka is a little town in Ohio, and in a bit of synchronicity, it's also the name of the street I live on in Los Angeles, Watseka Avenue. So the case concerns a girl named Lorancy Venom. She lived quite a normal life with her mother and father until one day she started going into trance states. And in these trance states, she encountered the spirits of departed humans. And one of them was a girl named Mary Roth, the spirit of a girl who had died some years before. And Mary Roth told Lorancy, I want to visit my parents, my family. They live near you. So I would like to make use of your body in order to do that. So after that happened, Laurentia Venom felt like a complete stranger in her own house, and she began talking of this Roth family. So her parents searched, and they found the Roth family and brought them to the house. And as they were coming to the house, Laurentia immediately recognized them. Oh, that was my mother, that was my sister. So both families agreed that Laurentia should go and live with the Roth family, which she did for several weeks. And during that time, she behaved perfectly as their daughter, just manifesting all kinds of detailed knowledge of the family history and the family affairs, things that would only have been known to Mary Roth. Then, after several weeks, Laurentia again started going into trance states. And Mary Roth told her, okay, I've seen my family, I'm going to go back to where I was. And when that happened, Laurentia Venom felt like a complete stranger in the Roth house. So then both families agreed she should go back to her original family. And what I find interesting about this case is that it was included by William James, a prominent psychologist, in his textbook, Principles of Psychology, as a genuine case of spirit possession. Now here's a case of an apparition of the spirit of a departed human. This is Charles L. Tweedale, who was a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society here in England. And he had an interesting experience as a child. He was about 12 years old. He was sleeping in his bed, and the moon was shining in through the window, and he happened to wake up, and he saw standing at the foot of his bed the form of an elderly woman. And then the form disappeared. So the next morning, he went to breakfast. His mother and father were there, and he said, Mommy, Daddy, last night, I saw the form of an old woman standing at the foot of my bed. So immediately, his father got up and left the room in a hurry, slamming the door behind him. So Charles asked his mother, Mommy, why did Father leave like that? And his mother explained to him, well, last night in our room, your father saw the form of his mother at the foot of the bed. Then later, they received a telegram that the man's father had died the previous night. So later in life, when he was an astronomer, Charles Tweedale calculated, because he could remember where the position of the moon was shining in his window on that particular date. And from that, he could calculate the time at which the apparition had occurred. And it happened to have been shortly after, just minutes after the woman's time of death. So this is a case of an apparition of a human spirit, an observation of a human spirit departing, reported by an astronomer. Now, cases of possession of human bodies by superhuman spirits, either of a divine or a demoniac sort of nature. Many of you have probably seen at one time or another the film The Exorcist. What many people don't know is that is based on an actual exorcism that was carried out by Catholic exorcists in the United States. It's an actual case. And if you recall the film, which is pretty accurate reflection of what actually happened, the boy in the film was possessed by a spirit that was not just like Mary Roth wanting to come and visit her parents. It was a possession by an extremely demoniac spirit, and this demoniac spirit acting through the body of the boy was carrying out just superhuman sorts of things. So there are cases like that. Then there are apparitions of superhuman beings. For example, the Marian apparitions are very well known in Europe. Generally, they're connected with healing places, like at Lourdes. And because these apparitions have occurred at a time when Europe was taken over by Christianity, the visions of these apparitions of these shining ladies are interpreted as Virgin Mary or something like that. However, in previous times, there are many cases in Celtic Europe, for example, of healing goddesses being associated with different places. So, who are these apparitions? Hard to say. Maybe they're the Virgin Mary, maybe there's some other healing goddess. And then there are the reports of the modern UFO alien abduction types of events. And among the researchers who study these things, there's one group which could be called the nuts and bolts researchers, who believe they're dealing simply with some other human beings pretty much like us who have similar type of technology, but just more advanced. They interpret it in just a mechanistic fashion. But there's another group of researchers who notes paranormal elements to the UFO and alien abduction types of events. For example, many of the people who have been abducted report communicating telepathically with the aliens or the extraterrestrials. They may report being floated through walls and things of that sort. So one of the researchers who's in that latter group was Dr. John Mack, who was head of the psychiatry department at Harvard University Medical School. Actually, both he and I were invited to speak at a crop circle conference in Glastonbury a few years ago. So we met there, and we had agreed to stay in touch with each other because we liked each other's research. Unfortunately, he died in a rather mysterious automobile accident in England a short time later, so we weren't able to keep up our association on that platform anyways. But he wrote in one of his books, "It appears ever more likely that we exist in a multidimensional cosmos. The cosmos appears to be filled with beings, creatures, spirits, intelligences, gods." Now you could imagine what sort of trouble that got him in with his colleagues at Harvard, who convened an academic court to try to have his tenure removed. Now he successfully fought that. So I think it was one of those rare individuals in the world of science who has the courage to speak out about these things. So if we have a multi-level cosmos, there are different features of that. One is travel between the different levels, which may be carried out in different ways. It may be carried out shamanically. This is Black Elk, an American Indian shaman, who reported being taken to other levels of the cosmos by his spirit guides. So that's one way to travel, through the different levels of the cosmos shamanically. And there are also those who report, being able to travel through these different levels in a mechanical way, but it's based on a technology quite different from what we're accustomed to deal with today. The ancient Sanskrit writings of India speak about vimanas, or spacecraft, that are able to travel not just from planet to planet on our level of reality, but interdimensionally, through different levels of the cosmos. There's also the phenomenon of information transmission between the different levels. This is a statue of an Assyrian king receiving communications from a sun god, Shamash. And in most ancient wisdom traditions, we have similar accounts. Now today, even modern science recognizes the possibility of receiving communications from extraterrestrials. Most governments of big countries have, at one time or another, had some program for SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Generally, this tends to involve receiving radio signals from outer space with radio telescopes. But there may be other ways in which extraterrestrials are attempting to communicate with us, such as through crop circles, for example. Another phenomenon is that beings at the higher levels of the cosmos are able to influence the forms of the living things on the lower levels. And we get some hints of this in phenomenon such as the Lourdes phenomenon. The story is very well known to little French girls. Some French girls went out to some cave near the village where they lived, and they saw the form of this shining lady. And in this cave there was a little spring, and then people would go to that spring and they'd experience miraculous healings. As I said, this has been interpreted through a Catholic lens, a Christian lens, but who knows? Healing goddesses have always been part of the European landscape, even before Christianity. But what I like about Lourdes in particular is that there's a medical institution there where they carefully document these cures. If a person comes in with some incurable disease or condition, it's carefully documented, and if a cure is experienced, that's also documented. There was a case of a French worker who had an extreme case of varicose veins, and then shortly after bathing in the waters at Lourdes, the case was completely cured. Now, it's interesting that the cures are not attributed to anything in the water. The cures are attributed to the higher being that is associated with that locality. So let me bring things to a close here, summarize what I mean by human devolution. What I'm proposing is that we begin our existence as beings of pure consciousness on the level of pure consciousness. Now, the ruling principle of that level of pure consciousness is love. Love for the source of all conscious beings, love for all other conscious beings. Now, if a conscious self becomes egotistical, if a conscious self becomes selfish, it can no longer exist in that harmonious level of pure consciousness. Then it comes down to lower levels. It may come down to the level of the subtle mind element, and it may exist there as an angel or god or goddess or astral being. Or it may come further down to the level of gross matter, where it will receive a covering of gross matter, and those coverings are what we call bodies. So what I mean by devolution is the process by which a conscious self becomes covered by the lower energies of mind and matter. So to put it in a nutshell, we don't, as conscious beings, evolve up from matter, as most scientists now believe. Rather, we devolve or come down from this level of pure consciousness. Now, the manner in which the form of pure consciousness receives a form made of matter has been a topic of speculation by philosophers for thousands of years. Plato, the Greek philosopher, had the concept that, yes, on the level of the absolute, there are forms of pure consciousness or pure spirit. And then through the agency of a creature he calls a demiurge, those forms of pure consciousness are translated into material forms on our level of reality. And there's something like that also in the Vedic cosmology. There's a creator god, sort of corresponding to a demiurge named Brahma. And from this creator god comes male and female goddesses. And it is through the sexual activity of these male and female goddesses who exist on higher levels of reality, that the forms of the plants, animals, and human beings on our level of reality come into existence. And in their reproductive activity, these gods and goddesses make use of bijas, or seeds. Bija is the Sanskrit word for seed, and the seeds contain the forms that are developed through this sexual reproductive activity. And there's an analogy to this in Western cosmology. The philosophers like Plotinus, St. Augustine had the concept of logoi spermatikoi, rational seeds. And this idea that life on Earth has been seeded, from extraterrestrial sources, is something that's even present in modern science. For example, Francis Crick, one of the scientists who discovered the spiral structure of DNA, had a panspermia theory that life on Earth has been seeded from elsewhere in the cosmos. And we also find in some of the modern UFO alien abduction type of accounts the idea of alien-human hybrids. And this is something that's very much present in the ancient wisdom traditions. There are many cases of people on Earth having celestial mothers and terrestrial fathers, or the reverse, celestial fathers and terrestrial mothers. Now, for example, there's the case of the warrior Karna in the Mahabharata, one of the ancient Indian epics. And he had a demigod father and a terrestrial mother. So, but I want to go back to this idea that the forms, the plants, animals, and human beings on our Earth are the result of sexual reproductive activities of gods and goddesses on higher levels of reality. Now, normally, on our level of reality, if there's reproductive activity, you can only produce your own kind. For example, if two humans mate, they produce a human child. If two dogs mate, they produce a dog offspring. But these higher beings are able to manipulate their reproductive processes so that they are able to produce bodies not of their own kind. For example, these gods and goddesses may produce bodies of plants. They may produce bodies of animals, birds, insects, human beings. Now that may seem a bit unusual in terms of modern science, but even modern science is getting into some pretty strange manipulations of the reproductive process. There's something called interspecies embryo transfer, whereby scientists take a fertilized egg of one species and plant it in the womb of another species, and the animal gives birth to an offspring that is not of its own species. There are cases like that. Here's one case here. But it's not very widely known, but these kinds of experiments are going on. There's also the phenomenon, again from modern science, of human sperm and human eggs being generated and stored in the bodies of other species, for example, mice. So this idea that all the kinds of bodies that we observe in our level of reality are the product of reproductive activities of gods and goddesses on higher levels may seem a little bit strange, but even our modern science is starting to get into some strange manipulations of the reproductive process. So again, to just wrap it up, we begin our existence on that level of pure consciousness, where we have a form made of pure consciousness. If we become selfish, we come down to the lower levels of the cosmos, where we need vehicles that allow us to function here. And those vehicles are produced by the reproductive activities of gods and goddesses who exist on this second level of reality here, the level of the subtle material energies. So that's what I mean by devolution, the process by which the pure conscious self becomes covered by layers of lower energies, mind and matter, and those coverings are what we call bodies. But it's a process that can be reversed. We begin with a form of pure consciousness. It becomes covered by the lower energies of mind and matter. But it's possible to restore consciousness to its original pure state. And that can be accomplished by different systems of contemplation, yoga, meditation, shamanic types of exercises. And as I said, I don't claim to have any monopoly on truth. The kinds of things I've been saying are not my own. They're the property of the ancient wisdom traditions, the common heritage of our whole human species. And if we can actually engage in this process of discovering what our real self is, it can be very helpful in resolving a lot of the problems that we have in the world today. Just like a geologist could tell us how to extract the element of pure gold from its ore where it's mixed with other less valuable elements. Now, once you've extracted the gold from its ore, you could form it into coins and stamp the coins with the symbols of different nations. But if it's really gold, it doesn't matter what symbol that you've stamped on it. So in the same way, if by some process of yoga or meditation or contemplation or mystic discipline, we're able to extract the element of pure consciousness from its covering energies and understand, yes, I am a being of pure consciousness. All others are beings of pure consciousness. We've all come from the same place. We're all related. We have higher needs. There's no need for us to be exploiting the resources of the earth in an unsustainable way. We should be trying to live our lives in the most simple. We should be living our lives in such a way that we satisfy our material necessities in the most simple, natural, and efficient way possible. And since we're all related to each other, there's no need to be fighting over less important things. If we're able to come to that level of awareness, then it doesn't matter what you call the process, how you label it, just as long as you get the result. So, just once more, I'd like to say, thank you to Karen for inviting me. Thank you all for listening. And I've just been, I think, giving another perspective on what's been said so well by those who've come before me today and who will come after. Thank you very much. Conflict that is not really very helpful in any way for our human civilization. So the solution to the environmental crisis, the solution to the intense levels of conflict, I believe has to lie with going back to the very root, back to our sense of identity, who we are, where we came from, where we should be going. And I think we need a new science that recognizes that there's more to a human being than chemicals, more to a human being than ordinary matter. We need a science that recognizes the vital forces, the vital energies that are there, that are part of the human essence, and that recognize the existence of a conscious self that can exist apart from matter. So what I've tried to do in my book, Human Devolution, is give some rational scientific justification for thinking that these things are true. And I'm not claiming any monopoly on truth, either for myself or for the Vedic perspective. I think truth can be found in many places, and I encourage people to look wherever their path leads them. Mine has led me in a certain direction, but others may follow different paths. And the first thing I want to show is that we really do need an alternative explanation for human origins in strictly scientific terms. Let's first look at what the current theories tell us. They tell us that life began on Earth from chemicals about 2 billion years ago. Then simple life forms arose in the oceans. Then they went to the land. Then about 40 or 50 million years ago, you get the first apes, and individually and collectively depend on our concept of the self, our sense of identity. And through the monopoly they now have in the education systems in most parts of the world, the scientists who support the Darwinian theory of evolution are giving us a very materialistic concept of the self. They're saying, well, as human beings, we are just machines made of matter. And if we accept that, and most people do these days, they tend to become very materialistic in the goals that they set for themselves. They tend to think that to produce and consume more and more material things is the main purpose of human life. And I believe it's this fundamental attitude, this fundamental mistaken sense of identity that is responsible for the world's environmental crisis. And Peter laid out some of the dimensions of that, and I believe also the underlying cause. And I believe the underlying cause is a materialistic, overly materialistic sense of identity. And we're told that not only are we machines made of matter, we are machines made of matter in competition with each other for survival. As Richard Dawkins charmingly put it, we are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. So I believe it's this attitude that is responsible for the intense levels of conflict, that we see in the world today. We see conflict on the level of individuals, conflict on the level of class, society, nation, religion, a lot of unnecessary ideas that most scientists today now have about this question of human origins. So reports of evidence that conform to these fixed ideas will pass through this intellectual filter very easily, which means that students will read about this evidence in their textbooks. People will see scientists talking about it on TV shows. If they go to the local museum, they'll see these discoveries. But if we have evidence that radically contradicts these fixed ideas, they tend to be ignored, forgotten, even actively suppressed. So I'm going to give a few examples of the kind of evidence that I'm talking about. This is Virginia Steen McIntyre. She's an American geologist who I know personally. When she was a young woman, just after she got her PhD, she was a rising star in her profession. But then she was called to Mexico to date an archaeological site called Huayatlaco. This is the excavation at Huayatlaco. The American and Mexican archaeologists there found human artifacts in layers of solid rock. And of course, they wanted to know how old they were. So they called a team of geologists to date the site. Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues used 4 different methods to date the site. And they got an age of about 250,000 years. But the archaeologists said, We can't accept that. That's impossible. According to their theories, human beings capable of making the artifacts didn't exist anywhere in the world at that time. They hadn't evolved yet. So they refused to publish the age for the site. Now the question I'm dealing with is, where did we come from as human beings, and how long have we been here? Now today, the most common answers to these questions come from the modern followers of Charles Darwin. And some of my friends tell me, Michael, maybe you're a reincarnation of Charles Darwin, and you've had to take birth again to correct your mistake. Well, the modern followers of Charles Darwin, many of them anyways, tell us that as human beings, we are simply complex organizations of molecules. That's what we really are. We're simply material beings. And as far as consciousness and love and all of that goes, that is just chemicals interacting in the brain. There's nothing more to it than that. There's no vital force or soul or conscious self. That's all just an illusion. We're really just machines made of matter. And as far as our human form is concerned, we're simply an evolved ape or monkey. That's what we are. And as we look towards the future, I don't accept this theory. First of all, because I believe there's some scientific evidence that contradicts it. But also, this theory, I believe, has some social impact. The goals that we set for ourselves, individual monkeys, and then about 6 million years ago, you get the first ape men, and then finally, about 100,000 or 200,000 years ago, you get humans like us for the first time on Earth. But ancient wisdom traditions tell a different story. For example, the ancient Sanskrit writings of India tell us that humans have existed since the very beginning of the history of life on Earth. We're not a recent appearance here. But many scientists will say, okay, well, that's what your mythology says, but all the physical evidence supports our point of view. It supports this evolutionary picture of human origins that we see here. But when I did 8 years of research into the entire history of archaeology, I found that there is physical evidence showing that humans like us have existed for millions and millions of years on Earth, going all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life here. And this evidence takes the form of human bones, human footprints, and human artifacts, many, many millions of years old. So I documented this evidence in this book, Forbidden Archaeology, which is about 900 pages long. Some people call it Forbidding Archaeology because it just seems like too much to pick up. So we brought out this book in a shorter edition called The Hidden History of the Human Race, which has now been translated into 20 languages. This is the Russian edition, the French edition. This is the Bulgarian edition. Now, the evidence that I document in these books is not very well known because of a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. We can call the blue box up there the knowledge filter, and it represents the fixed idea